August 7th, 2026. A huge stretch of severe weather is about to erupt across the United States as dangerous heat shifts to the east. Starting today, a cold front is going to trigger severe storms across the Midwest, with damaging winds, hail, and an isolated tornado possible. But this is only the beginning, because as we head into the weekend and early next week, this front is going to stall out, and that's going to allow repeated disturbances to trigger a daily cycle of severe thunderstorms and heavy rain running from the Great Plains all the way through the Great Lakes. Meanwhile, that dangerous heat dome is going to shift into the central and southern United States. This weather pattern is about to get pretty wild, so let's get right into the forecast because we've got a lot to talk about today. Let's start by talking about the overall risk of severe weather over the next several days, because it starts right now with today, Friday. The Storm Prediction Center already had thunderstorms increasing in coverage early this morning across eastern South Dakota into southwestern Minnesota, with stronger cells producing small to marginally severe hail before consolidating into a more organized cluster. That activity is expected to keep evolving through the day, and I want to walk you through exactly how this sets up the rest of today's severe threat. The main story for this afternoon and evening is going to be a corridor stretching from the Dakotas through Minnesota and Wisconsin, and then down into the middle Mississippi Valley, covering Iowa and Missouri. The main concern across that entire stretch is going to be damaging straight-line wind gusts and large hail, with frequent lightning mixed in as well. I do think there's a low-end tornado risk in play today, especially anywhere thunderstorms can organize into more discrete cells rather than just a broad line, though I wouldn't call it a high-confidence threat at this point, just something worth being aware of if you're anywhere in that zone. Now, if you live along the East Coast, we're also watching for scattered showers and thunderstorms developing this afternoon, starting up first near the DC and Philadelphia corridor, before spreading up into parts of the Mid-Atlantic through the evening hours. Main concern in that region is going to be scattered, damaging wind gusts, and I wouldn't rule out some hail mixed in either. Tornado risk along the East Coast today is very low, but it is August, and sometimes with these pop-up afternoon thunderstorms, you can get an isolated spin-up tornado almost by accident. So just keep that in the back of your mind if severe warnings do start firing off anywhere from Virginia up through southern New England later today. And then out across the desert Southwest, it's monsoon season, so we've got plenty of rain in the forecast over the next several hours, which is going to lead to some flooding concerns, specifically across Arizona and New Mexico. That's a separate story from the severe weather setup happening in the Midwest, but it's worth flagging on its own because monsoon flash flooding out there tends to catch people off guard, given how dry that terrain normally is. Now let's talk about why we're about to see this pattern really ramp up over the next several days, because it comes down to a specific setup in the upper atmosphere. Our mid-level and low-level winds are about to rapidly intensify across the Midwest, the Great Lakes, and the Ohio Valley. And that's happening because of a low-pressure system sitting well off to our north, up in Canada. As that system spins, we're going to get strong northwesterly flow developing beneath it. And when both the upper-level winds and the lower-level winds start intensifying like this together, that's exactly the kind of setup that tends to produce active stretches of severe weather. We're going to have enough moisture streaming into this region on top of a lot of atmospheric instability, and we're also going to have real wind shear in place, meaning the wind is going to be blowing at different speeds and from different directions at different heights in the atmosphere, which is precisely the ingredient that lets storms start rotating instead of just producing straight-line wind and hail. Here's the thing though, even though today's severe threat across the Midwest is relatively limited, I think Sunday is genuinely going to be a lot bigger, and here's why. By Sunday, we're going to start to see the flow shift more westerly aloft, and that's actually going to help pull our low-level winds around to come out of the south. When you get low-level winds out of the south, underneath upper-level winds coming more out of the west or northwest, and a supercell manages to form in that kind of environment, you can very easily end up with a significant tornado threat. I'm not saying that's guaranteed to happen, but it's genuinely on the table given how this pattern is setting up. And that's exactly why I think we're looking at an active stretch of severe weather running from today all the way through Sunday, Monday, and even into Tuesday. By Monday, I think that severe weather corridor is going to shift a bit and settle in over parts of the Midwest like Illinois, back into Ohio and Pennsylvania, where we could be watching a significant wind and tornado threat develop. And then Tuesday and Wednesday, that strong northwesterly flow is going to stick around, though by late Wednesday into Thursday, I think that northwesterly flow is actually going to start pulling down colder air, and that's going to help kick off a stronger cold front moving through the Midwest by the middle of next week. Then by Thursday and Friday, it looks like we're likely going to see yet another storm system develop across the Midwest, which should keep this entire severe weather pattern running practically non-stop for more than a week straight. Before we go further into the day-by-day timing, I do want to mention something because a few of you have asked about how I actually track all of this severe weather data day to day. And the honest answer is I rely on a dedicated weather platform that pulls together radar, satellite, and all the major forecast models in one place, rather than bouncing between a dozen different clunky government websites every time I want to check something. If you're the kind of person who genuinely wants to follow along with a pattern like the one we're discussing today, Being able to press and hold anywhere on a map and instantly pull up the nearest radar site, with a full 24-hour loop so you can actually see how storms have evolved throughout the day, rather than just a single frozen frame, makes a real difference in actually understanding what's happening, rather than just reacting to alerts after the fact. Being able to smoothly zoom and pan across the major forecast models, compare different model runs side by side, and tap literally any location on Earth to pull up a full forecast sounding is exactly the kind of tool that turns you from someone who just watches severe weather videos into someone who can actually read the pattern yourself. If that's something you're interested in, it's worth looking into, because having that kind of access genuinely changes how confidently you can prepare for a stretch of weather like the one we're walking through today. All right, now let's get back into the actual forecast. Let's talk more about the specific timing over the next several days, because there's a lot of nuance here worth walking through carefully. For today, we've already got showers and thunderstorms firing up across Minnesota and Iowa, and these are going to become more widespread as we move into the late morning and early afternoon hours. The main concern across the Midwest today remains damaging wind gusts and some isolated large hail. And I also wouldn't rule out an isolated tornado, since our significant tornado parameter values are going to tick up a bit this afternoon as low-level wind shear increases heading into the evening. So even though the Storm Prediction Center hasn't drawn a dedicated tornado risk area for today specifically, I wouldn't be shocked to see a tornado warning or two pop up somewhere in that Midwest corridor later today. Overall though, the headline threat for today is wind, and there's going to be plenty of lightning out there as well, so just stay alert for thunderstorms rolling through this afternoon and evening if you're anywhere in that zone. Along the East Coast today, we're looking at scattered showers and thunderstorms kicking off around mid-afternoon near Cleveland and Columbus, becoming more widespread as we move into the late afternoon and evening. Main concern in that region is scattered damaging wind gusts, potentially up to around 70 miles an hour in the strongest cells, with some pockets of large hail possible as well. Tornado risk stays very low here, but again, given it's August and we're dealing with these pop-up style thunderstorms, an isolated tornado wouldn't be shocking if the right storm manages to organize briefly. Across the southern plains, a large cluster of thunderstorms is going to be weakening through the morning across Oklahoma and Kansas, with another round of showers and thunderstorms expected to fire up again this afternoon. Main concern with any severe storms in that region will be damaging winds up to around 60 miles an hour, with hail fairly unlikely given the specific atmospheric setup down there today. Now as we move into Saturday, I'm not expecting any kind of widespread, headline-grabbing severe weather event. I think we'll mainly be watching scattered showers and thunderstorms across the interior Northeast, primarily Pennsylvania and New York, where there could be some damaging wind gusts and maybe isolated hail. Tornado risk stays very low across that region on Saturday, though I wouldn't completely rule out an isolated tornado sometime during the afternoon or early evening hours in central or eastern Pennsylvania, with those storms tracking toward Allentown and eventually New York City during the evening. By the overnight hours, most of that activity should weaken out. Sunday, though, is genuinely the day with the highest ceiling for severe weather out of this entire stretch. And it comes back to exactly what we discussed earlier, those upper-level and low-level winds ramping up significantly across the Midwest. We're going to get very strong northwesterly flow developing, meaning our winds are going to be changing direction and speed with height, which sets up a genuinely favorable wind shear environment. If we do end up with an organized severe weather event on Sunday, tornadoes are absolutely going to be on the table. Sunday morning, we're watching for a few isolated showers and thunderstorms, but the more concerning trend is what happens during the afternoon, because there's real potential for a supercell or two to develop. Our significant tornado parameter values are forecast to rapidly increase in a corridor running from around Watertown, South Dakota, all the way into southern Wisconsin. And if any storm manages to take advantage of that specific environment, it's going to have a tremendous amount of energy to work with. We're talking about instability values upwards of 4,000 joules per kilogram over Minnesota, and even climbing as high as 5,000 joules per kilogram in a couple of specific locations, with similarly extreme instability expected over Iowa as well. That kind of instability is genuinely remarkable, and it means this atmosphere is going to be primed for storms to explode upward rapidly once they get going. Current model guidance suggests that explosive storm development is most likely to actually happen across northern Wisconsin, with a supercell or two possible during the early to mid-afternoon hours, before storms potentially become more widespread later in the afternoon and into the evening. I want to be clear that I'm using words like may and possible deliberately here, because we're still a few days out from Sunday as of this recording, and conditions can absolutely shift between now and then. July and August are genuinely two of the hardest months of the year to forecast severe weather in, given how much smaller scale, more chaotic thunderstorm processes can influence how a day actually plays out compared to the more predictable, large-scale weather systems we typically see in spring. But even with that uncertainty baked in, there is a genuinely high ceiling on Sunday's severe weather potential right now, with widespread severe thunderstorms possible across Wisconsin and Minnesota specifically. By around 9 o'clock Central Time Sunday evening, we could be looking at a line of storms stretching from around Minneapolis back toward Milwaukee, and that activity is likely to become more widespread as we move through the evening and overnight hours, potentially consolidating into what meteorologists call a mesoscale convective system, essentially an organized cluster or line of thunderstorms that can maintain itself and travel a long distance overnight. That kind of system could end up impacting areas like Milwaukee, Grand Rapids, and possibly even Detroit during the overnight hours heading into early Monday morning. And I think we're likely to see this same basic pattern repeat itself on both Monday and Tuesday across the Ohio Valley and the broader Midwest, with several additional rounds of thunderstorms continuing to fire off as this northwesterly flow stays locked in place. One of the trickier parts of this entire forecast is figuring out exactly what happens after Sunday, because there's genuine uncertainty there. But I do think the Ohio Valley and Midwest are going to remain the primary focus given how persistent this northwesterly flow is expected to be. Monday's activity looks like it'll be mostly centered over Indiana, Ohio, and possibly Illinois, and then Tuesday could see that threat re-spark a bit further west, back over Iowa, Wisconsin, and Illinois, extending into West Virginia. And here's a detail worth taking seriously, given how much thunderstorm activity we're looking at across this same general corridor throughout the early to middle portion of next week. There's a genuine risk of significant flooding developing on top of the severe weather threat itself, since repeated rounds of heavy rain training over similar areas day after day is exactly the setup that overwhelms the ground's ability to absorb water and leads to flash flooding. Precisely the kind of pattern we've already been tracking recently across Iowa and West Virginia specifically. By Thursday and Friday of next week, I think things should start to dry out a bit across the Ohio Valley region specifically. But looking further out, there's a signal in the longer range models hinting at a fairly strong low pressure system developing over the northern plains roughly a week from now. If that system does end up materializing the way current guidance suggests, we could be looking at another more organized severe weather threat, covering essentially every hazard type: wind, hail, and tornadoes, which would genuinely be a notable setup for this time of year, given how August typically behaves compared to the more traditionally active spring severe weather season. While all of this is unfolding across the middle of the country, it's worth taking a quick moment to check in on the tropics, because the Atlantic has been remarkably quiet. Genuinely, I haven't seen an Atlantic hurricane season this dead in quite a while at this point in the calendar. We've had essentially nothing of real consequence so far, and I think that's likely to continue, largely because of how strong the current El Niño pattern is running right now, which tends to keep the western, central, and eastern Pacific considerably more active while suppressing development across the Atlantic specifically. That's obviously good news for anyone along the Gulf Coast or East Coast watching for tropical development. The one catch worth flagging, though, is that if we do end up getting a hurricane at any point later this season, given how much abnormally warm water is sitting out there waiting to be tapped into, it could very easily become a major hurricane rather than a modest, run-of-the-mill storm. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. Genuinely good news that things have been quiet so far, but a real reason to stay alert if anything does eventually manage to form and organize. Now, back to the flooding concern I mentioned a moment ago, because I want to walk through this in more detail since I think it deserves real attention heading into the middle of next week, specifically across the Ohio Valley. The GFS model, which is a deterministic forecast model, meaning it produces a single, specific forecast outcome rather than an ensemble of multiple possible scenarios, is currently showing a widespread 3 to 7 inches of rain across a significant stretch of the Ohio Valley, with some specific spots even showing totals as high as 8 inches. That's a genuinely striking number to see from a deterministic model like the GFS, because you typically only see rainfall totals painted that high and that widespread from a high-resolution, more localized computer model, rather than a broader, coarser deterministic model covering a wide geographic area. Seeing pixel-level totals that high on a model that isn't specifically designed for that kind of fine-scale precipitation detail is a genuinely concerning trend worth taking seriously. Now, the European model, which many meteorologists consider to be one of the more reliable global forecast models available, isn't showing quite as extreme a total, but it's still depicting a large area with a widespread 1 to 3 inches of rain expected across that same general region. So there's real model disagreement on the exact magnitude here, but both models agree on the general theme: meaningful, potentially heavy rainfall settling in across the Ohio Valley heading into the middle of next week. And that's exactly the kind of signal worth continuing to monitor closely over the next several days, since even the more conservative European model total, layered on top of the multiple rounds of thunderstorms already expected across this same corridor, could be more than enough to trigger the same kind of flash flooding we've already covered extensively out of West Virginia and Iowa this summer. If there are any major shifts in this trend over the coming days, I'll be sure to update you on it directly. Now, the other major piece of this forecast that honestly nobody wants to talk about right now, unless you happen to live in the parts of the Midwest we've spent most of this video discussing, is temperature, because it is brutally hot out across the central and southern plains right now. We're looking at highs reaching up to 115 degrees today across southern Kansas and northern Oklahoma, which is genuinely punishing heat by any measure. And that heat isn't going anywhere anytime soon. In fact, it's actually going to get even stronger across the central plains heading into Saturday, with that heat dome building further into South Dakota and Nebraska, pushing high temperatures well into the triple digits across that region. Sunday and Monday, it's going to get even worse across these same areas. If you live in central Kansas specifically, I genuinely feel for you, because we're looking at highs around 112 degrees on Sunday. Louis is forecast to come in around 101 degrees, and by Monday and Tuesday, that heat is essentially going nowhere, staying locked in place across the same general footprint through at least Tuesday or Wednesday of next week. After Wednesday, though, we should finally get a genuinely strong cold front pushing through the Midwest and Great Lakes, and behind that front, low temperatures are going to dive all the way back down into the 30s, 40s, and 50s across parts of Minnesota and Wisconsin, which is a genuinely remarkable temperature swing for this time of year. I specifically say 30s because there's a real possibility that some areas of northern Minnesota could actually drop into the 30s by the middle of next week. That's obviously worth flagging as a potential concern for anyone growing crops up in that region, though at least for right now, it doesn't look like temperatures are going to drop all the way down to an actual freeze, which would be a genuinely serious concern for agriculture this early in August. So stepping back and pulling this entire pattern together into one clear picture, here's what we're actually looking at over the coming week and a half. Today, Friday, we've got a cold front triggering scattered severe storms across the Midwest, with damaging wind, hail, and an isolated tornado risk, plus a separate, more limited severe threat along the East Coast this afternoon and evening. That front is then going to stall out rather than pushing cleanly through and clearing the pattern, which is really the central story of this entire forecast. Because a stalled front means repeated disturbances riding along it are going to trigger a genuinely daily cycle of severe thunderstorms and heavy rainfall running from the Great Plains through the Great Lakes for essentially the next week straight. Sunday looks like the highest ceiling day within that stretch, with genuinely extreme instability building across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa, and a real possibility of significant organized supercells and a legitimate tornado threat if storms can properly take advantage of that environment. Monday and Tuesday should see that severe threat continue shifting through Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, and back into West Virginia, with a growing flash flood risk layered directly on top of the repeated severe weather, given how much rain both the GFS and European models are now showing settling into the Ohio Valley by the middle of next week. Meanwhile, dangerous, borderline record heat is going to keep building across the central and southern plains right through this same stretch, before a genuinely strong cold front finally breaks that heat by later next week, bringing a dramatic, almost fall-like temperature swing back into the upper Midwest. Given everything we've just walked through, here's what's actually worth doing with this information if you live anywhere within this broader risk corridor over the coming week. If you're in the Dakotas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, or Missouri today, make sure you have a reliable way to receive severe weather alerts that doesn't require you to actively be checking a radar app every hour, since today's threat, while not headline-grabbing on its own, still carries a real risk of damaging wind, hail, and an isolated tornado. If you're anywhere near that Sunday severe weather corridor specifically, running from around Watertown, South Dakota into southern Wisconsin, treat Sunday afternoon and evening as a day to stay genuinely weather aware, rather than making plans that would leave you far from shelter, given the extreme instability values in play and the real potential for organized rotating supercells. If you're anywhere in the Ohio Valley heading into the middle of next week, specifically Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, Kentucky, or West Virginia, keep a close eye on both the severe thunderstorm threat and the separate compounding flash flood risk, since repeated rounds of heavy rain training over the same corridor day after day is precisely the setup that's already produced dangerous, fast-moving flooding elsewhere across the Midwest this summer. And if you're anywhere across the central or southern plains right now, particularly Kansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, or South Dakota, treat this heat with the same seriousness we've discussed on this channel before. Limit outdoor activity to the early morning hours, stay aggressively hydrated, check on elderly neighbors and relatives without reliable air conditioning, and never leave children or pets in a parked vehicle, even briefly, given how quickly interior vehicle temperatures can become genuinely lethal during a heat wave reaching 112 to 115 degrees. Stepping back from the day-by-day details, here's the bigger picture worth taking away from this entire forecast. What we're looking at over the next week isn't a single storm system passing through and then clearing out. It's a genuinely stubborn, stalled weather pattern that's going to keep recycling severe thunderstorm potential across essentially the same broad corridor of the country, day after day, while simultaneously baking the plains under dangerous, prolonged heat and building a real flash flood risk on top of it all by the middle of next week. That combination, repeated severe weather, sustained dangerous heat, and a growing flood threat, all unfolding roughly simultaneously across different parts of the same general region, is exactly the kind of complex, multi-hazard pattern that's genuinely difficult to forecast with precision this far in advance, particularly given how notoriously unpredictable July and August severe weather setups tend to be, compared to the more classic spring severe weather season. That's exactly why I'll be continuing to track every piece of this pattern closely as we move through the weekend and into next week, and updating the forecast directly if any of these trends shift meaningfully from what we've walked through today. We'll keep bringing you updates on this pattern as it continues developing, whether Sunday's severe weather setup across Minnesota and Wisconsin lives up to its current high ceiling, how the flash flood risk across the Ohio Valley evolves as we get closer to the middle of next week, and exactly how hot this current heat wave across the central and southern plains ultimately gets before that cold front finally arrives. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel and have that bell icon turned on so you're notified anytime we go live to track severe weather in real time. Because with a pattern this active and this uncertain, conditions could shift meaningfully with very little advance notice. Thank you all again so much for watching today's forecast, and we will see you in the next video or the next live stream.